There are a number of places that we can look for the evidence of various styles. Primarily we look to the columns, we look to the capitals, the areas at the top of the columns. We also look to the entablature, which is the area, it's basically the lintel, the long horizontal area atop the columns. And within that entablature is an area called the frieze. This is an area where we will see a lot of sculpture and a lot of architectural detail. Above that frieze, above the entablature, which includes the frieze, is the pediment. And the pediment is that triangular shaped area that is at either end of a temple. The function of the pediment is simply to hold up the roof. It holds up a wooden roof. It will also be a place that we can look for identifying factors for the different orders. And it will also be a place where we will have sculpture. We will see sculpture in the pediment go from very low relief to more figurative, to more three-dimensional, to more life-like, and eventually the pediment will house larger-than-life, realistic, freestanding images of men and gods. Examples of the pediment: this is very low relief, more figurative, very stylized, not real lifelike, but clearly figures. These figures we might associate with the archaic period. They're stylized. They're not particularly naturalistic, but they are human figures. They're more three-dimensional. This is a rebuilt or a reconstruction of a Greek temple, but it shows you the pediment, the area above that long horizontal frieze, and you see that it is filled with sculpture. Okay. The sculptures do become, over time, as we go through the different orders and as the Greek aesthetic develops in the direction of naturalism and life-like characteristics, we see more and more realism appear in the figures. Okay. And then here we have this is again a reenactment, but it shows you these are life-size, freestanding, three-dimensional images of man and animals in various mythological scenarios. Here we have the ruins of a Greek temple, and it clearly shows you the columns, the capitals, those areas at the top of the columns, the entablature, which includes the frieze, that sculptural piece, and the pediment, the triangular shaped piece at the top. Okay. Sculpture is found throughout the temple, and again, these images will become more and more and more lifelike. One of the things to remember too is very often we tend to think of the Greek temples as these very stark, white, glaring, formal settings, when in fact these would have been painted, and the painting would have been done realistically, and it would have been a way to enhance the naturalism of these figures. Okay. We can look at various places related to the columns. In the very earliest of Greek temple building, these columns would have set right on the temple floor. This slide shows a base that is put under the column, and it also gives you an idea of how detailed and how ornate even the bottom of the column will become. These three images show you clearly the distinction between the earliest of the orders, the Doric on the left. It has a geometric shaped capital at the top of the column. It's that round disc shaped area. The area above that, the entablature, includes a frieze which has triglyphs or geometric patterns. Above that, we would find a pediment that probably had low relief sculpture or more geometric design. those areas in the pediment will become more and more detailed, more and more three-dimensional as time evolves. When we begin talking, let me stop right there. When we begin talking about the Corinthian order, the second of these slides, there are changes in the way that the aesthetic taste or stop. Okay. When we look at the Ionic order, the second in our slides here, you notice that the capital, the area at the top of the column, is now in this curved scroll-like shape. That shape is called a volute, and it is inspired by the unfurling of a palm frond. The idea here, the overriding idea here is that rather than just thinking about geometric shapes and designs and patterns, which they did in the Doric era, or with the Doric order, when we move into the Ionic, we're looking more to nature for our inspiration. Again, this is part of that development of the aesthetic taste for more naturalism. So we see this graceful, curvilinear capital. Above that, we have the entablature, which includes layer after layer of very intricate, ornate details and designs. The outside of the temple, the areas that are ornamented are becoming more complex, more involved, more detailed. The columns are becoming taller and thinner. The look of the buildings themselves are generally lighter and more graceful looking than perhaps the heavier, shorter, stouter looking Doric order. So we're going from heavy, more massive, more functional, more basic, to more graceful, more naturalistic, more elegant looking as we progress through the orders. The column on the far right is done in the Corinthian order. Remember, that is the order that we said was developed by the Greeks but used primarily by the Romans. And by the time we get to the Corinthian, we have tremendous amount of detail, very tall, thin columns, very lifelike images in the pediment, and even in the capitals, which is what we're looking at here. Even in the capitals, we see not just an inspiration of nature, but what is intended to be a lifelike representation of a real plant, the acanthus leaves. These acanthus leaves are beautiful, and they're detailed, and they grow upward, which elongates the building. And they also are believed to be sacred. They're part of the sacred acanthus trees or plants. So here we have, again, the development of the concept, the complexity of the technique and the image, and more development over time. Okay, so here we have a variety of examples showing you the Doric style, which is rather sturdy, with its capital is plain. They can be square, rectangular. Think geometric. The columns themselves, heavier, stouter, more massive. Okay? And the overall look of the structure, pretty solid and pretty formidable. The Ionic style, the order that comes next, is more elegant and more graceful. The capital is decorated with that scroll-like design, the volute. Image on the right is showing you both the base of the capital, which is very detailed and ornate, and The image on the right is showing you both the base of the capital, which is very detailed and intricate, and did I say that? I did it again. Stop. Okay. The image on the right is showing the base of the column, which is very intricate and detailed, very complex patterns and designs. And it's also showing you the top of the column with the capital, with that scroll-like volute inspired by nature. Okay. The Ionic temples, or the Ionic buildings, tend to appear taller and more graceful, more elegant. Okay. Many of the revivals of the Greek tradition throughout history, we will see the revival of Greek influences over and over and over again. We see this many times. You might notice them on government buildings or banks. Oftentimes they're done in the Ionic, in a version of the Ionic order. Okay. And here we have the Corinthian style, seldom used in the Greek world, but seen in Roman temples on many occasions. The capital is very elaborate, very, very detailed. The diagram on the left is intended, again, to remind you that all of this is done in a very rational, reasonable, methodical way. There's a connection between the height and the width and the distance and the relationship of all of these different pieces. The ultimate goal is to create the perfect temple. If we can create the perfect temple, the gods will come down and reside in the temple. Again, examples of the Corinthian order. Here we have Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Included here are a number of questions that you might want to think about. They cover the main ideas that we've discussed in the section on the Greeks, the main concept of progression and what it means in Greek painting, sculpture, and architecture. One question asks, in what ways does the early Greek sculpture resemble the work of the Egyptians? Early on in the Greek tradition, there is a connection. There are similarities, but unlike the Greeks, the Egyptians were not necessarily looking for progress and development. They weren't necessarily looking for constant change after change after change. Okay. Another thing we can do when we're looking at the information on the Greeks is we can compare the different periods in the Greek style to each other. Hellenistic, certainly there are characteristics that are similar between the classical and the Greek, but there are also, because of the progression and development, some major stylistic differences.